everyone, it's Jack from Cultaholic.com. It's Friday, gotta get down on Friday, and you also know what that means. It means it's my favourite time of the week because it's time to talk about my wrestlers of the week. But before we get on to the official top 10 and all that business, I want to talk about next week's wrestlers of the week because a few people have suggested on Twitter that I do a special double episode next week, like I do for WrestleMania weekend. I'll explain why. The reason people have been asking this is because not only do we have NXT this weekend and SummerSlam, we also on Monday have the G1 finals, we also have various little events taking place over SummerSlam weekend, almost like a mini WrestleMania weekend. And even though some of those take place, one took place yesterday, I think, a few today, they'll go up on demand sort of next week, I'm kind of predicting. So there'll be a lot of matches to talk about and far too many wrestlers. But, I like to keep the double episodes for WrestleMania, I like to keep them special. If you think I should do a double episode next week with 20 points up for grabs and 20 wrestlers on the league table, then let me know in the comments down below. Likewise, if you don't think I should do that, also leave a comment down below. And we'll try and gauge general opinion and then go with the most popular option. Because this is a democracy, damn it, even though it's a series based entirely around one man's opinion. Now onto the honourable mentions. Big shout out to Alexa Bliss and Nikki Cross, who are new WWE Women's Tag Team Champions. It turns out Alexa wasn't even manipulating Nikki at all. They're just really good pals. She's helped her win her first title in WWE. We all doubted you, Alexa. I'm so very sorry. Also, a lot of people on the Triple Mania card impressed. I don't know if any one performance was enough to warrant a place on the Wrestlers of the Week league table, but I would like to shout out, for example, the two guys in that very bloody main event. Two legends, Blue Demon Jr. and Dr. Wagner Jr. Also, Cain Velasquez, who made his wrestling debut and can actually wrestle to the astonishment of just about everybody. The Bucks did well again. The Lucha Brothers did well again, as we knew that they always would. And also, on the pre-show, I was really impressed by someone I wasn't even familiar with at all, really. Dragon Bane, who did some crazy high-flying moves and really did put himself on the map, at least for me anyway. I'd never really heard of him before, and now I'll be keeping my eye on him. And finally, some G1 Climax performers who just didn't quite make it on this week because it was a very strong week. Hiroshi Tanahashi, Will Ospreay, no points for Will this week. Ooh, and Zack Sabre Jr. as well. Three great guys, three great lads, love them all. Three great performances though, and just it wasn't enough on what was a very strong week. Now on to my top 10. This week's number 10 is a man we're all very familiar with, maybe the most famous masked wrestler in history, at least in American wrestling, Rey Mysterio, or as Matthew calls him on our podcast, Rey Mysterio Jr., because Matthew's a WCW soul at heart. Rey had the best match on WWE TV this week, taking on his old foe Andrade on Raw. They'd had a little bit of a feud when they were both over on SmackDown, and this carried on into Raw and just picked up where they left off, basically having another excellent wrestling match. It's actually quite astonishing how well Rey is still able to go in the ring despite being well into his 40s by now. He did that whole belly slide thing under the bottom rope into a Canadian Destroyer on the outside. All kinds of moves that Rey Mysterio has pulled off flawlessly for decade after decade now. He is an absolute marvel of the pro wrestling world. The only thing that stopped Rey from picking up a few more points this week was the fact that on SmackDown he was made to look a little bit weak. Dolph Ziggler just battered him before then going on to defeat Ali, and it was a little bit like, Rey's been, swept under the carpet again after having an excellent match on Raw. But at the same time, if you're not going to use one of the older legendary guys to help get younger guys over, like that fresh young upstart Dolph Ziggler, then what's the point of having them around? But the main reason that he's on this week is because of that wonderful match with Andrade. Number 9 this week is Andrade as well, for that match on Raw against Rey Mysterio. Andrade actually picked up a big victory here, and it wasn't just a great match, as I said, ungraded in terms of just wrestling moves and the execution of various spots. It was really good as well in terms of storytelling. Andrade going after Rey's mask, sparking rumours once again that they're going to build towards maybe some kind of hair versus mask match. I'd like to see that very much. He got the win with a bit of help from his manager, Zelina Vega, as well, who didn't distract Rey. She actually physically attacked him, didn't she? Rey was leaning across the bottom rope, ironically in a 619 position, maybe the middle rope. She gave him almost like a stunner, dropping his neck onto the rope, and then Rey rebounded into the ring and fell victim to Andrade's hammerlock DDT. Excellent win for Andrade, big result, and a wonderful match on WWE TV. Number 8, and now we go from WWE TV to Ring of Honor TV. Ring of Honor haven't featured quite as highly on Wrestlers of the Week, or quite as frequently even, as they perhaps should have given the talent at their disposal. They are a company that are struggling right now, but this week was a good reminder that they are still capable of booking a very good match, and the wrestlers in the match all following through. So this week's number 8 is the current reigning Ring of Honor World Champion, Matt Taven. Taven defended his title in a triple threat match against, I think it was Jay Lethal and Kenny King. Really good match, it had a really good flow to it, and importantly, Matt Taven retained his title clean. They did a really good job in this match of making it look at points like maybe either King or Lethal were going to win, especially Lethal, who has just had an iron grip on that Ring of Honor World title for much of the 2010s, but wasn't able to get it back in this match. Matt Taven retains the title and carries it forwards into Ring of Honor's next big show. And even though I think Matt Taven's great and underrated and I really do enjoy him, I'm not rooting for him in that match because his opponent is one of my absolute boys, Alex Shelley. Even though that event has kind of been slept on a little bit in the build-up to it because there's just so much going on this weekend with NXT and SummerSlam and all that sort of stuff, I think that one of the matches I'm most invested in, just from a pure fan standpoint, is that Ring of Honor World title match because I really want Alex Shelley to pick up the victory. I don't think he will. I think he'll just be used to galvanize Matt Taven's reign. And that's probably the sensible thing to do as well. But if Alex Shelley were able to pull off the victory and win the Ring of Honor World title, I would be so delighted. You might be wondering, Jack, why are you such a massive Alex Shelley fan? That's because in the mid-2000s, when I was a little teenage rapscallion, I was a huge, die-hard fan of the Motor City Machine Gun. I absolutely love the MCMG boys. Detroit, Michigan, all that stuff. Oh, I'm not cool enough to like them, but I do like them. They make me feel cooler by watching them. Number 7, now let's go to the G1 Climax and one of my favorite New Japan wrestlers, Tetsuya Naito, the leader of LIJ. He had 2 really good matches this week, one way better than the other. His match against Jeff Cobb was good and very enjoyable in its own right, but the big match to talk about here was the all-LIJ clash against his stablemate, Shingo Takagi. Naito was able to win both matches, which has shot him right back up into contention to win the B block and to progress on to the G1 Climax final on Monday morning, which myself and Sam will be live streaming, do not forget that. Now, I think that Naito is going to make the final, but it's not predictable at all. New Japan have done a really good job this year of keeping Block B really unpredictable. There are 4 guys currently, all in a 4-way tie, and those guys are Naito, Moxley, Goto, I think, and Jay White as well. And out of all those 4, I can honestly see Naito progressing to the final and maybe even winning the whole thing. There is a storyline in place should Naito win and get that shot at Wrestle Kingdom for the title, assuming that Okada is still the champion. They've really been building up this whole Naito wanting to be a double champion thing. He's currently the IC title holder, and if he were to win the IWGP Heavyweight title at Wrestle Kingdom, that sort of dream of his would come true. Now, I wonder if they also want to book that match because their last match in the main event of Wrestle Kingdom, last time Naito won the G1, was a really good match, but it was a little bit underwhelming at the same time. I think people expected that match to be better than it actually turned out to be. And if they get another chance to go at it, who knows, maybe they'll go all out and put on like an absolute match of the year candidate. So there is a storyline in place should Naito win, and that's making me think that maybe he actually will as well. And I think that would be his second G1 victory in like 2 or 3 years or something. He is really a megastar in New Japan right now. Number 6, another LIJ member and another participant in the G1 Climax. Everything is evil, and evil is everything, and evil's big, and big is evil, and evil is good at wrestling. Evil went 1-for-1 this week, first defeating Will Ospreay in a great match, but then losing to Kazuchika Okada in another excellent match. I think I actually preferred the second match of the 2. Whoa! I preferred a non-Ospreay match to an Ospreay match. What's going on? Now, I think that, if you just excuse my little rant for a second, I think that even though he lost that match against Okada, that actually made him look stronger in defeat than the victory over Will Ospreay did. Evil looked like an absolute bulldozer in that match with Okada. Okada had to throw absolutely everything at him to keep the LIJ member down, and several times, almost like Ishii, Evil would fire up, no-sell some strikes, and come back at Okada twice as hard, only for Okada to eventually put him down for the 3 count. So that was a really good match. We know about the chemistry of Evil and Okada. They've had some great G1 matches in the past as well. But I honestly think this may have been my favourite Evil match of all time. He also had an absolute banger once against Kenny Omega that I seem to recall as well. But this one was really up there for me in terms of my favourite Evil matches. Other favourite Evil matches? Any Buried Alive match? That was awful. Absolutely awful. Let's get on to number 5. Number 5 is the Rainmaker himself, the man we've just talked about, Kazuchika Okada, because of course he had that excellent win over Evil, but also he lost against another LIJ member. LIJ are all over the place this week, Sanada. Now this was very interesting in terms of what kind of rivalry the two have going on. The funny thing is that, especially in the non-WWE landscape where everything's a bit less linear, wrestlers often have multiple feuds going on at once, and those feuds are of a very different nature. So for example, let's take Ospreay for example. He's had, a blood feud with Jimmy Havoc. Anytime they clash, it's going to be really hardcore and intense. But he also had that rivalry going on at the same time, around the same sort of time, with Ricochet, where it was more of like a one-upsmanship contest. And then also he had that ongoing years and years long rivalry with Marty Scurll, who was kind of his nemesis, who quite often had the better of Will Ospreay. There's various different types of rivalries that a wrestler can have going on at the same time with different people, and Okada is absolutely no exception. He's had rivalries going on with Naito, for example, that epic one with Kenny Omega, the recent one about, Jay White defecting from Chaos over to Bullet Club, and I think that throughout all of that, there's been one link, and that link has been Sanada. He's had a little ongoing thread with Okada all the way through that sort of time period, and he could never quite get the job done. Okada always had his number, and this week, Sanada finally beat Okada, and it was a huge, monumental result, and Okada played his part in defeat exceptionally well. I'll talk about that match a little bit more later on, but Okada basically had a really, really good week in both victory and in defeat as well, especially in defeat. I guess this week's been a weird one because guys have lost matches but come out looking better than the ones they've won. But the long and short of it is that Okada is in with a very good chance of winning the A block and progressing to the final. It's going to be him versus Ibushi in a straight showdown. If it's a win for Okada or a draw, he goes through to the G1 Climax final. If Ibushi wins, he goes through to the G1 Climax final. I think that match could be a match of the year contender. I'm really hyped for it, and I think they're going to score some serious points next week. Number 4, another man we've just talked about, Kota Ibushi. Now, Ibushi had 2 very good matches this week with 2 men who we know already that he's got tremendous chemistry with. One was against Zack Sabre Jr., who he's wrestled multiple times in multiple promotions and always killed it. And also against Hiroshi Tanahashi, the man who defeated him in last year's G1 Climax final. That match against Tanahashi, I think, was probably my favourite of the 2, but they were very even. Ibushi had a really strong and consistent week with his performances, as he so often does, I guess. But that win over Tanahashi felt especially significant. It felt like Ibushi overcoming a hurdle that last year prevented him from winning a G1 Climax that many people, including myself, had predicted that he would indeed win. But in defeating Tanahashi, I think Ibushi is now the favourite to beat Okada as well and go on to the final of the G1 Climax. If he meets Naito in the final, I'm not certain he's going to win that, but if he meets any of the other 3 guys in contention from the B block, Moxley, Goto and Jay White, I think this is Ibushi's for the taking, so it very much depends on who wins the B block as to Ibushi's chances. That is if Ibushi even makes the final. Okada could well make the final, but because he's the reigning champion, I think they'd rather have Ibushi make it instead, and that builds in a future feud for next year. It's all... You know what, right? New Japan book things like no one else. They've got such long-term storylines in mind. And when you know those storylines and you familiarise yourself with them, it makes the product so much more enjoyable on a deeper level. Next up, let's talk about number 3 this week, Sanada, who had the biggest week and the biggest result of his entire career so far. This was a monumental week for Sanada, as I mentioned, defeating Kazuchika Okada, the current reigning IWGP Heavyweight Champion. And this is very interesting going forwards. Like I implied before, these New Japan storylines, they keep going, and sometimes you'll forget about something, but then they'll bring it back. And if you pin a champion in non-title action in the G1, the chances are you're probably going to get a title shot somewhere down the line. This is very, very interesting for Sanada because this means, I think, that he will potentially plug the gap between the G1 Climax final and Wrestle Kingdom in January. In between sort of the G1 final and Wrestle Kingdom, it's hard for New Japan to book things creatively just because no one's expecting the title to change hands. It seems like a main event's already built in place for Wrestle Kingdom, which is already still a few months down the line. But there's always kind of a viable challenger they book to plug that gap in the sort of the fall and the winter. And I think that man is going to be Sanada. He finally won against Okada after I think being like 0-6 or something against the Rainmaker. And the fact that he's won will probably lead to a rematch. And even though I really can't see Sanada winning the IWGP Heavyweight Championship, that match again, I think, will be fantastic, as the one this week was too. It's also worth shouting out Sanada's other opponent this week, Lance Archer, a man who has been the kind of surprise standout for me, the sleeper hit of this year's G1 Climax, and I just think he deserves a really big mention because he's been part of some excellent matches, especially that first one against Will Ospreay in Texas. I think that was one of the best matches of the whole tournament, and I think he's honestly just really surprised me. He's not the youngest guy in the tournament, not the smallest or the most nimble, but he's really managed to hold his own with some of the best wrestlers in the world. Number 2, the Stone Pitbull, Tomohiro Ishii. Now, let's think about this. In the past 3 weeks, Past 4 weeks, including this one, Ishii's gone first place 10 points, first place 10 points, first place 10 points, second place 9 points. He nearly made it 4 in a row, which would just have been outrageous, but there was someone this week who impressed me just a little bit more. I can't actually talk about Ishii too much this week. I won't waste too much time talking about him because then I'll reveal who number 1 is essentially. But he had an amazing match this week. The best match of the week, arguably the best match of this year's G1 Climax as well. Perhaps a match of the year contender. In fact, yes, definitely a match of the year contender. And his opponent, I'm going to talk about in just a second. But again, Ishii lost the match, and in defeat, he was able to just, oh God, sell his arse off. He was wobbling. Even after the bell, he was struggling to walk. It was really cool to see Ishii go in so selflessly to try and help get another member of the roster over. And it's not just this week that he does that. He does that each and every time he steps in the ring. So yes, salute to you, Tomohiro Ishii, for an incredible run of form over the past few weeks. You've managed to absolutely set the G1 alight, and you are my personal G1 Climax MVP, and I suspect a lot of you guys agree with me on that one. Tomohiro Ishii has been untouchable in this tournament. Also, before we move on to number 1, I've just realised that I've said the phrase "in defeat" a lot this week, so I'm just waiting for some smart ass to comment "Jack, in defeat, king" in the comments, because that'll get quite a few likes. Well, it definitely is going to now that I've said it. But number 1 this week, and my new wrestler of the week, dislodging Tomohiro Ishii from his throne, it's the next big Shingo Takagi. So yeah, Shingo had 2 unbelievable matches this week, 2 of the best matches in the entire tournament so far. One against Naito, which was really, really good, of course, as I mentioned earlier on in the video, and then that one against Ishii. I think Meltzer gave it 5.5 stars. Having watched it, I'd definitely give it 5 if I were to rate it myself. Maybe 5.25. Maybe I'd push it above the standard sort of scale. I'm not quite certain, but regardless of the way you look at it, I think you have to accept that this was a remarkable wrestling match. It basically went as you'd imagine Ishii versus Shingo to go. A lot of strikes, a lot of no-selling, a lot of just blasting each other, kind of a war of attrition between 2 incredibly powerful men. And it's this sort of match that really brings out the whole strong style aspect of New Japan. A style which has kind of been not missing because you've got guys like Ibushi and everyone carrying it on, but it's certainly been compressed a little bit, and there's been a lot of other styles getting into New Japan over the past year or 2, since Shinsuke Nakamura left, the king of strong style. But there are still people carrying that style forwards throughout New Japan, and 2 of those guys are Shingo and Ishii, and this match was like a perfect meeting of 2 perfectly matched opponents. And even though both of them are out of contention to win the G1, the crowd was still right up for it. It was the main event of the night, and it did not disappoint. So without any further ado, let's take a look at the league table. Ishii really has secured second place for himself, but Ibushi is up to 3rd and Okada is up to 4th. It seems like the top 4 frontrunners are really starting to establish themselves, but of course Gargano has a huge match at TakeOver this weekend. Not too far behind though, it's been a huge week for LIJ, with Naito up into 12th, Shingo up into 13th, and Sanada up into 15th. A massive, massive week on Wrestlers of the Week for that stable. Thanks very much for watching, and let us know what you think in the comments section down below. You can follow Cultaholic on Twitter at Cultaholic and on Facebook at facebook.com/Cultaholic. If you enjoy what we do, then please do check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Cultaholic, where you can pledge. And don't forget, of course, most importantly of all, to hit subscribe and to join us.